I spent 3 grueling months clearing thick brush, grading stubborn red clay, and hauling tons of crushed limestone to carve a private road to my farm, paid for every single inch of it with my own sweat and savings, and the very day I finished, the local HOA dropped a heavy steel gate right across the middle and told me I had to pay them a monthly subscription to access my own dirt. They thought I was just another old farmer who'd roll over and sign the check. But boy, were they about to find out exactly what happens when you try to cage a man on his own land. My name is Silas Thorne. I'm 45 years old, and I run a patch of earth in the rugged backcountry of Oakhaven County, right where the pine forests start to thin out into rolling pasture, and the air smells like rain and diesel instead of scented candles and freshly mowed golf courses. And this land has been in my family since my great-grandfather cleared the first acre with a mule and a prayer, so we don oppos. T have fancy stock portfolios or vacation homes in the Keys, but we've always had this. Dirt. Dirt we worked until our hands bled, dirt we paid taxes on, and dirt that meant something more than just a property line on a map. But lately, the world has started filling up with people who don oppos. T understand the concept of earned ground. People who think a laminated set of bylaws and a neighborhood committee can outrank 100 years of family history. This whole mess didn't end oppos. T start with a gate or a lawsuit. It started with a simple problem of logistics, because for years, the only way into my farm was a narrow access road that cut straight through the Willows, a high-end suburban development with identical beige houses and an HOA board that acted like they were the high council of some tiny, lawn-obsessed kingdom. And I didn't mind the dirty looks they gave my beat-up dually truck, but then they passed quote, community tranquility, and quote, ordinance that banned heavy equipment and farm vehicles between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., which for a working farm is basically a death sentence, because if I can't move hay, haul cattle, or receive grain deliveries during the day, I'm out of business. And when I tried to sit down with them and explain that cows don oppos, T check the HOA schedule before they need feeding, the president of the board, a woman named Victoria Sterling who looked like she'd never stepped in a puddle in her entire life, just smiled that thin, rehearsed smile and told me that, in quote, the aesthetic of the community was not negotiable, in quote, and that my, in quote, industrial activity, in quote, was a nuisance to the new residents. I was losing money hand over fist, watching my bank account drain while I sat idling at the edge of their pavement waiting for the clock to strike 7. And one night, sitting at my kitchen table looking at a stack of overdue invoices, I remembered the old timber trail on the north side of my property, a path that had been swallowed by 20 years of forest, but technically connected to a county easement that hadn't an oppos. T been touched since the Eisenhower administration, so I called my daughter, Riley, who was home for the summer from her civil engineering program, and my old friend Jax, a man who could fix a combine with a paperclip and a heavy rock, and I told them we were going to build our own way out, and for the next 90 days, we lived in the dirt, swinging chainsaws until our shoulders screamed and running an old rented bulldozer until the sun dipped below the pines. And there's a specific kind of peace you find in that kind of work, a rhythm where the only thing that matters is the next 10 feet of gravel and the fact that no one can tell you, in quote, no, in quote, but I didn't in oppos. T realized that Victoria and her board were watching us from the ridge with binoculars, calculating exactly how they were going to turn my hard work into their profit. The morning we finished, I drove my truck down that fresh silver gravel, feeling the tires bite into the stone, and for the first time in a year, my chest didn't in oppos. T feel tight. I felt like a free man on my own land, but 3 days later, Jack called me, sounding like he'd swallowed a wasp, telling me I needed to get down to the easement line immediately, and when I pulled up, there was a massive, industrial-grade steel gate anchored in fresh concrete, right where my road met the public trail, with a shiny keypad and a sign that read, in quote, Oakhaven Access Management, authorized residents only, monthly access fee, $185, in quote, and standing there in a white linen suit that probably cost more than my tractor was Victoria, holding a clipboard like it was a scepter, and she looked at me and said, in quote, Silas, we've decided to incorporate this service road into our community security perimeter, but out of neighborly spirit, we're willing to grant you a pass for a small maintenance fee, and, quote, and I just stood there for a second, not angry yet, just stunned by the sheer, unadulterated gall of it, and I asked her how she planned on charging me to use a road I built on land she didn't in Oppos, Tion, and she just adjusted her glasses and said, and quote, "Our lawyers have interpreted the easement as a shared asset, and since it borders our development, we have the right to secure it, unless, of course, you'd like to discuss selling that north pasture to us, in which case the fees might go away," end quote. That was the moment I realized this wasn't and Oppos, T about, end quote, tranquility, end quote, or, end quote, security, end quote. It was a land grab, a slow-motion mugging designed to choke my farm until I had no choice but to sell out so they could build another row of beige houses, and Jax was already reaching for a chain in the back of his truck, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. But I put a hand on his arm because I knew that if we tore that gate down, we'd be the ones in handcuffs and Victoria would have the headline she wanted about the, end quote, violent, unstable farmer, end quote. So I looked her right in the eye, didn't in Oppos. T raised my voice, didn't in Oppos. T curse, and I just said, end quote, "Victoria, you spent your whole life thinking everything has a price tag, but you forgot that some things are just owned," end quote. And she just laughed, a little high-pitched sound that didn't in Oppos. T reached her eyes and told me I had 24 hours to pay the first, end quote, enrollment fee, end quote, or she'd have my truck towed if I even touched the keypad. So we drove back to the house in a silence so thick you could have cut it with a hay knife, and Riley was already on her laptop, her eyes glowing with that, end quote. Don and Oppos, T messed with my family, end quote. Fire I recognized from her mother, and she said, end quote, "Dad, Don and Oppos, T get mad, get the paperwork, because I think they just committed a very expensive mistake," end quote. The next week was a blur of dust and old manila folders. We turned the kitchen table into a war room, digging through property deed from the 1920s and county surveyor maps that were so old they felt like parchment, and we discovered that Victoria's, end quote, legal interpretation, end quote, was a total fantasy because the easement wasn't end Oppos. T just a public right-of-way. It was a, end quote, non-abandoned agricultural corridor, end quote, which in Oak Haven County law means it can't be gated, period. But Riley found something even juicier while she was digging through the public HOA filings. She found that, end quote, Oak Haven Access Management, end quote, wasn't Oppos, TA security company at all. It was a private LLC registered to Victoria's husband's business partner, meaning they were using HOA dues from the residents of the Willows to build a gate on land they didn't in Oppos, Tion, so they could kick back fees to their own private company. And while they were busy posting photos of me on the neighborhood Facebook group calling me a, end quote, squatter, end quote, and a, end quote, threat to property values, end quote, we were building a dossier that was starting to look like a mountain, and then things got ugly because one night a pair of heavy trucks drove onto the start of my road and dumped 4 tons of jagged asphalt scrap and broken glass right across the path, and they didn't in Oppos. T realized Jax had installed a hidden trail cam in the trees that caught the whole thing in high def, including the logo on the side of the truck, which belonged to the construction firm currently building Victoria's new backyard pool. I spent the next morning on my tractor, clearing that trash with a heavy heart but a steady hand, and every time the bucket hit the ground, I just thought about my grandfather, who had stayed on this land through the Great Depression and 2 world wars, and I realized that if I gave up now, I wasn't in Oppos. T just losing a road. I was failing everyone who came before me. So we didn't in Oppos. T called the police yet. We called a woman named Martha, end quote, the Hammer, end quote, Vance, an attorney who specialized in rural land disputes and had a reputation for eating HOA boards for breakfast. And when she saw our binders of evidence and the video of the dump trucks, she actually smiled, which was a terrifying sight. And she said, end quote, "Silas, usually I have to dig for the bodies, but Victoria just handed me the shovel and pointed to where she buried them," end quote. And we filed a massive injunction, not just to move the gate, but or civil racketeering, end quote, tortious interference with a business, end quote. And we didn't in Oppos. T tell a soul, we just waited for the, end quote, emergency community safety meeting, end quote, Victoria had called to, end quote, address the farmer problem, end quote. Walking into that clubhouse was like stepping into a lion's den. If the lions wore cashmere sweaters and drank sparkling water, and Victoria was up there on the stage, basking in the spotlight, telling 300 worried neighbors that my, quote, unregulated road, quote, was going to bring crime and noise into their paradise, and she had a slideshow and everything. But then Martha stood up in the back of the room, her voice cutting through the chatter like a gunshot. And she didn't into oppose. Just ask a question. She walked up to the stage and handed Victoria a pile of documents that made the woman's face go from tan to translucent in about 3 seconds. And Martha started laying it out for the whole neighborhood to hear. How their dues were being funneled into a private shell company. How the gate was built on a legal lie. And how Victoria had used a local contractor to illegally dump hazardous waste on my property. And you could have heard a pin drop on that plush carpet until one old man in the third row stood up and shouted, and quote, "You spent our money on what?" End quote. And the room just erupted into absolute chaos. People were standing on chairs. The board members were arguing with each other. And Victoria was just standing there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, while I just sat in the back with Riley and Jax, feeling the weight of the world slowly lift off my shoulders. The judge didn't oppose. Just ordered the gate removed. He ordered Victoria and her husband to personally pay for the restoration of my road and awarded me enough in damages to finally buy that new grain silo I'd been eyeing for a decade. And the best part was the day the county sheriff showed up to supervise the removal. Victoria had to stand on her designer lawn and watch as a crew of workers, the same one she'd hired to build it, cut through those steel posts with circular saws that sent sparks, flying 10 feet into the air. And Jax leaned over to me and said, and quote, "Sell for about 50 cents a pound at the scrapyard. Maybe we should offer to haul it away for her," end quote. And we laughed, a real, deep laugh that felt like it had been bottled up for a year. And as the last piece of that gate hit the dirt with a heavy thud, the road finally looked the way it was supposed to, open, honest, and mine. And I drove my truck through that gap, heading home to a farm that was finally safe. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it, Oppos? We live in a world where people think they can just draw a line and erase a century of history, where they think a title or a bank account gives them the right to dictate where a man can walk or how he can work. And I'm curious, have any of you ever had to deal with a neighbor or an organization that thought they owned the air you breathe? Did you fight back? Or did you find a different way around? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it, because as far as I'm concerned, the only thing more stubborn than an HOA president is a farmer who knows exactly where his property line ends and his pride begins. And if you enjoyed this story of a little bit of rural justice, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more, because there's plenty more dirt to move and plenty more stories to tell from the Grayson Trail.